Hello and welcome to Seeking Gnosis. My name is Danny and I am a seeker of hidden knowledge. This video is going to be a critique of the objective personality system, which was created by Dave and Shannon Powers, formerly known as Dave Superpowers on YouTube, and also affectionately known as Shave on Facebook. I want to make clear before I get into my critique of OP that I have no personal beef with Dave and Shannon. They seem to me to be good people with good intentions. I actually met them once last year at a meetup they did when I was in the objective personality class because I live not far from where they live. And I had a really good time chatting with them. I mean, they are giants. They're super tall, and I'm short, so I kind of felt like a hobbit next to them. But I've kind of always secretly wanted to be a hobbit, so it's totally okay. No, but honestly, I had a good time chatting with them. They're very intense people, they're very kind. And so this is not meant to be a personal attack against them. I just want to express my thoughts on the system that they've created, because I believe that nothing should be beyond scrutiny, and it's through constructive criticism that something can be refined and perfected. I know that people kind of have a tendency sometimes when they discover a system like this to really idolize the creators and see them as like infallible sources of knowledge and authority. But it's important to remember that they are people and they can make mistakes. I'll start with the things about OP that I am actually totally on board with and agree with. So first of all, the desire to be more objective when typing people is a great thing. We are all subject to personal bias, whether we are typing ourselves or other people, so it's important to try to overcome that. I also like how they are always stressing that everyone can do everything, and you need to see a pattern repeat over and over again before you form a conclusion. So I think that's great. I don't know if they always follow their own advice, but I agree with the principle. I also share in their frustration with MBTI groups in general, and the rampant stereotypes and the blind trust in personality tests that really just only serve people's self-delusions and gives them excuses for their bad behavior. And so definitely combating that kind of stuff, I'm all for. I also agree that 16 types is not really enough to describe all the variation that we see with people. So understanding the spectrum of different subtypes within each of the 16 types is really helpful. I love the concept of animals, of the different combinations of the functions and how you prioritize them in your psyche, as well as the sexual modalities, how each function can be used with a more masculine or feminine attitude. Those concepts can be really helpful in understanding the really subtle differences between different people that are of the same type. So I have to give Shan and Dave and Shan, Shave, credit for discovering those patterns. Now, having said all that, I do see some big issues within their system. In general, what I see lacking is depth. Jungian psychology is called depth psychology for a reason. It's trying to get down into the depths of the psyche of what's going on beneath our behavior and the external world that we can observe. It's trying to get into the motivations behind our behavior. Now, Dave and Shan are both NTJ types. They are in the gamma quadra, so they use the NISE and FITE functions. And this is very evident in their system and how it's designed, especially in the lack of introverted thinking, TI, and introverted sensing, SI. So typology is a very NT thing, right? It's about abstract patterns that are based on logical categories. And objective personality is trying to make it more scientific. So they're trying to ground it in reality, in the sensory world. So they're trying to do this with their ST functions, which in their case are both extroverted. They both use TE and SE. So rather than, taking a step back to integrate the data that they've collected and analyze it deeply, they just keep collecting more and more data, typing more and more people. And as long as it works for their immediate needs, that's good enough, and they just keep going. So they don't take the time to really get deep into the theory or actually analyzing the data that they have. And they've typed something like 3,000 people now, I think. So they have a lot of data. They have many examples of at least each of the 16 types, if not, 32 or 64. So they could go back and do some statistics, see if there are additional patterns, correlations with different traits, things like, maybe disorders or sexual orientation. They do mention that they have noticed certain patterns, but it's just their observations. They don't go back and actually crunch the numbers. At least it doesn't seem that they're doing that. And I imagine that the reason that they don't do this is because they don't have time, because it's their business and they need to make money, and so they have to keep typing more people, and there's a lot of demand for typing people. But that's not an excuse. If they really wanted to do it, I'm sure they could. And maybe they're doing more of this behind the scenes, they just don't publish it. So, if so, correct me, but that's my impression. Their theory is also lacking real good definitions. Like I said, it's lacking introverted thinking. The descriptions of the functions and the other coins are very simple. They're just a few words on their website and in the class. And even in the videos, they never really give detailed technical descriptions of the functions. They just give lots of anecdotes and general statements, but never anything very definitive. And, well, something can be said for simplicity. When you're talking about concepts that are generally very difficult for most people to grasp, limiting your definitions to just a few keywords can really just cause more confusion. For example, saying that thinking has to do with reasons doesn't really help if you don't explain what a reason is. Because in everyday colloquial language, a reason is just a justification, and it could be based on emotion or on logic. So it's not necessarily something to do with the thinking function if you don't understand what kind of reason you're talking about. So I'm sure maybe in Dave and Shan's mind, they have a certain definition of these terms they use, and they're hoping that people will catch on. But it would be a lot easier if they could give a little bit more description, a little bit more real definition. Another issue is that they claim to be using the scientific method to type people. So they type people independently without consulting each other until they eventually both agree on a person's type. Now, this is not insignificant. It's actually quite an achievement, and it took a lot of hard work. They say it took them years. But to say that it's completely scientific is a bit of a stretch. What it means is that they have both aligned with each other, but it doesn't mean that they aren't biased. It just means that they have the same bias. They're seeing the same patterns. Objectively determining a person's personality type is actually impossible because the psyche, a person's cognition, what's going on in their mind, cannot be observed. And to use the scientific method requires observation, empirical observation. And with the technology that we have today, we can't do that. Now, maybe at some point in the future, someone will develop a way using technology or psychedelics or other ways of entering altered states. People like Rupert Sheldrake are researching things like telepathy and finding some really amazing things. So go Google that if that's interesting to you. But as it is now, we cannot objectively observe someone's psyche and what's going on in their mind. When it comes to determining your own type, however, you do have a major advantage. Although an unbiased evaluation is difficult because of the ego's tendency to only see certain parts of yourself, the parts that you've deemed acceptable, you can observe your own cognition. You can develop a higher level of consciousness that is aware of what's going on in your mind. You can learn about cognitive functions and then catch yourself actually using them. So if objectively determining type is impossible and we're stuck with subjective evaluation, then the one subject that can actually observe your cognition at all times ought to be given the final authority. Yes, we should definitely consult with other people, get their input, make sure that we're not ignoring certain behaviors. But ultimately, no one can know you better than you can know yourself. I know that Dave and Shan are always joking how, we're all stupid monkeys that are peacocking all the time. But I think we ought to give ourselves a little more credit. Now, maybe the average human today is woefully lacking in self-awareness, but it is possible to develop it. Jung talked about integrating the shadow, and that is what the goal of typology should be. So if that's what we're trying to do, if personal growth is what we're trying to achieve, then mistyping shouldn't really be a big issue. Because if you've been mistyped, either by someone else or by yourself, then you'll eventually figure it out if you are actively trying to integrate your functions and balance out your psyche. So if identifying as a certain type doesn't help you in that process, then you can pick a different one and try that out for a while and see if that matches your experience better. Eventually, you'll find one type that matches your experience and helps you bring balance to your psyche, and then you can know with certainty that that is your type. The biggest discrepancy that I see between the objective personality system and my understanding of typology is their definition of introversion and extroversion. They seem to be working with kind of the colloquial definition of it, the way that people who don't really have any background in psychology talk about it, which is something like introverts like to be alone and extroverts like to be social. If you look on the OPS website, it says explicitly introvert, extrovert, personal opinions, social spectrum. But if you're familiar at all with Jung's work, you know that this is not what it is. It's not so much to do with how much you interact with people, but rather how much your energy and attention is on the external world of objects, everything outside your own mind in reality, or on the inner world of the psyche, your subjective experience, your memories, your opinions, your judgments, all these things that are only accessible by you because they're in your mind. To use a cognitive function with an extroverted attitude means that your attention is on external objects, which of course includes other people, but is not limited to them. There are plenty of other things in the world besides people. Now this gets really problematic when you get to the human needs that Dave and Shan have associated with each of the functions. Now, on the surface, this idea makes sense, this idea that each type of function serves a certain need, and I can agree with it for the most part. I agree that introverted perceiving or observing helps us organize information, and extroverted observing or perceiving allows us to gather information. But when it comes to the deciders or the judging functions, it kind of falls apart for me. So they say that DE serves the human need of tribe validation or connection, and DI serves the human need of self-identity or significance. But this does not make sense when you have a correct understanding of introversion and extroversion. So let's break this down. I hope this can be very clear. The deciders, or the judging functions, are how we make decisions. They take some kind of input, whether it's a physical, concrete object or an abstract idea, and they come to some kind of conclusion about it. They judge it in some way. When deciding is extroverted, then decisions are made by referencing the external world, the objects, the people, everything that is outside of you. When deciding is introverted, then decisions are made by referencing the inner world of the psyche, a person's experiences and knowledge that they bring with them. So why then do Dave and Shan say that the deciders are all about people? Certainly, people are a part of the external world, so they'll be taken into account with extroverted deciding, but decisions can be based on things as much as they can be based on people. This seems to me to be a conflation of DE with the feeling function, because the feeling function, both FE and FI, whichever one you use, is concerned with validation and connection with other people, because it's the ethical function that's concerned with the emotional needs of self and tribe. Thinking, even when it's extroverted, is by definition dispassionate and emotionally detached. It doesn't care about emotion. It's like computational, robotic. It's like a computer. It's how we understand the mechanical causes and effects of the universe by observing it. It's basically the scientific method. Now, obviously, no human, unless they're a psychopath, ever uses thinking in isolation without some emotional motivation. But to say that using TE is always, to get validation cookies seems to be an oversimplification of human needs. Maybe they just want to figure out how nature functions. Maybe it's a purely self-motivated desire, especially if they're an Enneagram 5, for example. Of course, everyone desires connection and attachment to other people because we're a social species. But it's not from the DE function that we get that necessarily. When it comes to extroverted feeling, it can serve the need of tribe validation and connection, but it can also serve the need of establishing boundaries. It can serve whatever need is relevant for the situation. What DE provides you with is a way to make decisions that are congruent with your environment and that require you to actually engage with the environment. But it's not doesn't necessarily involve people. When it comes to DI being associated with the need for identity, I can mostly agree with that idea, but I do think it's a little too general, because identity could also be associated with introverted observing or perceiving. I think, for example, an SI dominant type might have a strong sense of identity because they identify with all their experiences, even if they don't have very well developed DI. What DI does give you is a consistent personal philosophy or ideology, a framework for interpreting your experiences. So if I were to give more accurate descriptions of these functions, I would say that DE is practical decision making, while DI is consistent decision making. I also think it's important to note that these human needs are psychological needs, but we also have many more emotional needs that we can have satisfied through using the feeling function. For example, we all need material security, food, sexual partnerships, um, community, all these other things we also need. Now, you might say that this distinction I'm making is nitpicky and that the self tribe dichotomy is a good enough proxy for the difference between DE and DI. It obviously is a pattern that can be observed in people. Dave and Shan consistently see it. And I guess it can be helpful to notice this because, OP is pretty popular with people. However, I don't think that correlating this difference with the cognitive function of DE and DI is justified. I think what they're tracking is probably something that's more a result of socialization than an innate cognitive preference. Because I think an EJ is not necessarily going to put others before themselves. They are just going to be focused on results rather than consistency. They're practical minded. They want to get results. And an IP is not necessarily going to be super self-centered. They're just going to try to maintain consistency in their decisions. So, maybe this is this kind of the same thing that they're seeing, but I imagine that it has caused some mistypes and it's not really a one-to-one correspondence with the functions. OP seems to skim the surface of personality and focuses mostly on external behaviors and categorizing behaviors according to the functions that are being used. And so then the advice given is usually something like, do the behaviors that are associated with your daemon functions, and then your life will be better. But I don't think that really goes deep enough. I mean, it certainly can help, it can make your life easier, but it won't really lead to real transformation. Real transformation requires you to really get into the deepest, darkest parts of your mind and explore the emotions and ideas and traits that you've repressed and denied and see as completely other. And so just doing something like cleaning your room if you're an EP is not going to help you do that very much. I mean, it's certainly not a bad idea. It can help. But once you do that and you need more, I don't see OP really providing much direction of how to seek out that real change. It's also not entirely clear to me what the goal is supposed to be. I mean, they talk about growth mindset a lot, which is great, but what is the goal? It seems like their definition of making it is basically attaining economic success, getting fame, becoming like one of their, alpha celebrities. And personally, I don't really buy into that. Just because that's what our culture today rewards people for doesn't mean that that should be our ideal. I think Dave and Shan would do well to, consider the ideologies that they've bought into. I mean, I know personally, it seems like what it takes to be a very successful entrepreneur almost requires you to sacrifice important parts of your life. It requires so much time and hard work that is not necessarily conducive to having a balanced life. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. The way that they split up the types and say that everyone has two savior functions and two daemon functions seems a little too rigid. They always talk about how important it is to have a growth mindset, and yet within their system, there's no way to distinguish between someone who, is totally one-sided, all in on their dominant function only, and someone who has balanced out their functions and no longer really has any daemons. And so they give the impression that someone's type of the 512 is fixed, when that's not how I understand it at all. I mean, I think it's most likely that we are born with, a certain function stack, and maybe a dominant function, but other than that, we can change and develop over time according to our experiences. So I think, for example, someone that has worked on integrating their functions, balancing themselves out, can kind of transcend their type of the 512 and become, a healthy, balanced INFJ or ESFP, or maybe even just, beta quadra, gamma quadra. And this is actually where I like cognitive type, which is a different typology system, because they have what's called development levels that can change over time. Now, cognitive type also has its advantages and problems, but I'll save that for another video. In conclusion, I think that the objective personality system is an interesting theory that introduces some important and useful concepts. It can be helpful in your personal growth journey to a limited extent, but I do think that ultimately it is lacking in validity and depth. As far as its relation to other typology systems, I kind of see it as opposite in many respects to socionics. While OP is lacking in introverted thinking, socionics is just totally oversaturated with TI. It is very theoretical and there's lots of detailed definitions, but it does seem to be a bit disconnected from reality. It's not totally grounded. So the future that I hope to see in typology is people trying to bridge between these different systems and find what is good and valid in all of them and get rid of what isn't. And then together we can create the best system and work on really understanding ourselves and each other and transforming ourselves and the world. So I'm excited to see how this plays out. That's all for this video. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel so you can be notified when I release any new content. And peace out and have a wonderful day.